As promised, here is my special sermon on the Great Tribulation of Judea. And this sermon is, of course, part of my efforts to teach through section 6 of Matthew's Gospel, which is again from about the end of chapter 20 all the way through to the very end of chapter 25. I've labeled that section 6 of Matthew's Gospel. This section describes the events of Jesus' final visit to Jerusalem before his crucifixion. So I've titled this section, Jesus Pronounces Judgment Against Israel and Its Leaders, because when Jesus does get to Jerusalem, that's what he spends most of his time doing. He declares judgment against them for their rejection of him and their other sins. As of now, I'm teaching through the fifth and final portion of section 6. So we go from, again, sections down to portions, and we're in the fifth portion of section 6. And this portion is entirely dedicated to a private sermon from Jesus to his disciples, which we call the Olivet Discourse. And that, of course, is Matthew chapters 24 and 25, the entirety of both of those chapters. In this portion, Jesus predicts and describes the destruction of Jerusalem's temple, his second coming, and the end of the age. So this is, of course, a somewhat end-timesy portion, but also, I think, had some relevance for that generation listening to him at that time. Now, amazingly, we have spent 6 sermons on the Great Tribulation of Judea. So this is sermon number 7, I believe, on all of that. Let's go ahead and read that passage again. This is Matthew 24, verses 15 through 21, where Jesus says this. It says, "Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Whoever is on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. Whoever is in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." Now, this sermon will finish our discussion of this great tribulation of Judea by focusing on that final description given by Jesus in verse 21. So when he says, "For then there will be a great tribulation, such as has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will." That is the whole focus of today's sermon, or this sermon, I guess this evening's sermon. I'm recording it in the evening. Now, as you know, I've been arguing that this great tribulation of Judea took place during the Great Jewish Revolt against the Roman Empire, specifically during the Second Roman Siege of Jerusalem. So the Great Jewish Revolt was from about the year 66 and really lasted through the year 73. The Siege of Jerusalem happened in the year 70, very much in the middle of that, and as the climax and centerpiece of the Great Jewish Revolt, which was a failed revolt. And I think what Jesus describes as the Great Tribulation of Judea is that, the Great Jewish Revolt. However, the question we have to answer is whether the suffering of that time was great enough, or at least unique enough, to say that nothing like it had ever happened before, and that nothing like it would ever happen again. And if you remember from my previous sermon, I made the argument in there that it may not be the degree of suffering that matters, but the quality of it. Whether it is a different kind of suffering than other suffering, and a very unique kind of suffering. So that is very much a consideration we have to keep in mind. But one way or another, we have to answer that question. Does verse 21 accurately describe the Great Jewish Revolt and all the suffering in that time? Well, my answer to that question is yes, and I have this sermon to prove it, and that's the whole point of this sermon. And again, I remind you, this sermon is not necessarily meant for all ears. That's why we're doing it in this special way. This has a lot of sensitive information in it, so it's not a rated G sermon by any means. And so be sure you want to hear this stuff if you want to proceed any further beyond this point. Now, I've called this sermon Ground Zero, and my outline for this sermon has 5 headings, and as I always do, I will tell you what these 5 headings are, so you know where I'm going with all of this, and gives you an idea of how I'm arguing this point. So first, the opinion of Josephus goes partway to confirming the words of Jesus. I'm going to make an appeal to a historian who witnessed these things and wrote about them to back up how Jesus describes the Great Tribulation of Judea, the Great Jewish Revolt. Secondly, the rebels in Jerusalem brutalized one another and also their own people. So in that second heading, I'm going to talk about all the Jew versus Jew violence that happened there in the Great Jewish Revolt, there in the city of Jerusalem. Thirdly, the Romans committed their own atrocities against Jerusalem when they finally arrived. And that's what we usually think of, and that is the climax of it all, but there's a lot before that too. But I do want to spend some time on the specifically Roman atrocities that were committed against the Jews there. And then fourthly, I want to identify the single greatest and deadliest enemy of the Jews in that time, which was starvation. So I want to describe just how terrible it was to be alive at that time without hardly any food, is going to be the point of that 4th heading. And then finally, my last heading, the staggering body count at the end of the siege of Jerusalem indicates the worst slaughter ever. And I think when you think about the numbers and the time frame and the details of it all, it really is a horrific slaughter, certainly worthy of the Great Tribulation, greater than anything before or afterward. So those are my 5 headings. So if you have your doubts about the wisdom of spending a whole sermon on this point, please realize I simply want you to believe Christ. That is the real goal of this sermon. I want you to hear the words of Jesus and say, yes, absolutely true. Jesus was right about all this. If Jesus tells you about earthly things and you don't believe him, how will you believe him if he teaches you heavenly things? This is the point that Jesus made to Nicodemus in John chapter 3. And it's a good point for us to remember here and now. If Jesus is going to make a comment about an earthly matter, like the Great Jewish Revolt, and you can't fully believe him on that, how are you going to believe him on all the really important stuff about eternal life and salvation? So this is important. It's important to believe Jesus and be able to believe Jesus. Therefore, let's move forward through this difficult topic and make sure that no subtle doubts remain in our minds about this particular teaching from Jesus and what it means and whether he was right. And of course I do think he was right, and we do have the right course here in thinking that the Great Jewish Revolt is in his mind. So let's talk about that in the greatest possible detail and finish this. So let's come to the first heading that I have in store for you tonight, or today whenever you're watching this. So first, the opinion of Josephus goes partway to confirming the words of Jesus. So here, of course, we're appealing to our main historian for all of this, Josephus. And as you know, he is our primary source. We do have some other sources, but nobody wrote more about the Great Jewish Revolt than Josephus did. And of course, he was there, and he was on both sides at different points in that conflict. So he is a very important witness. And in his book, The Wars of the Jews, he often says that he thinks that the suffering of the Jews at that time was the worst suffering ever, period. He very often says this in his book. I just want to read one of these passages for you to show you what I mean by this. So let's see here. All right. So Josephus, this is from the preface to his book, The Wars of the Jews. So here's what he writes. But if anyone makes an unjust accusation against us when we speak so passionately about the tyrants or the robbers, or solely bewail the misfortunes of our country, let him indulge my affections herein, though it be contrary to the rules for writing history. because it had so come to pass that our city Jerusalem had arrived at a higher degree of felicity than any other city under the Roman government, and yet at last fell into the sorest of calamities again. Accordingly, it appears to me that the misfortunes of all men from the beginning of the world, if they be compared to these of the Jews, are not so considerable as theirs were. So there you have Josephus' opinion on the sufferings of the Jews at that time. That comment from somebody who actually was there takes us part way to the judgment given by Jesus. Josephus says from the beginning of history, all men up until that day, like their sufferings are nothing compared to just the sufferings of the Jews at that time, which is half of what Jesus says in Matthew 24, verse 21. He covers the first half of history and says nothing like this ever happened before. Josephus agrees with that opinion. So in the very least, we have some reason to believe that the tribulation of Jerusalem at that time was more severe than any other before it. However, we can truly say, that's the question we got to ask, can we truly say that no later tribulation would ever be any greater or have a more unique quality to it? Can we honestly say that based on the information we have about the siege at that time? Well, on the one hand, we could hardly be surprised at what Christ has said. The leaders of the Jewish nation were about, this is from the time of Jesus, of course, they were about to commit the worst sin of all history, that being handing Jesus over to be crucified by the Romans. They were about to commit the most blasphemous, most wicked action ever. And that being the case, we might expect that God would respond to the murder of his Son with the greatest wrath ever to be revealed on the earth. It would be very fitting for Jerusalem at that time to suffer the maximum calamity, or the most unique calamity of all calamities. It would be very fitting given the sin they just committed. And yet some Christians doubt, and many unbelievers also doubt when they come to this passage, whether the suffering of the great Jewish revolt could be this greatest of all tribulations. Well, in a previous sermon, I mentioned that some Christians understand the entire Olivet Discourse rather differently than I do. They understand it as being entirely future, that it talks about things that even we have not seen. So here we are in the 21st century still waiting for the fulfillment of things that Jesus described in the Olivet Discourse. Some Christians do take that view, and one of their reasons is because they don't think that the sufferings of the Jews during the Great Jewish Revolt could possibly qualify as the Great Tribulation described by Jesus. Well, for my part, I am completely satisfied that the Great Jewish Revolt fits that description. I am satisfied that the Great Jewish Revolt does indeed fit the description of this Great Tribulation of Judea that Christ has been describing. In some cases, people of my persuasion assert that Christ has described the Great Jewish Revolt using hyperbole. Now, hyperbole is a deliberate overstatement. It's, when you say, this is the worst day ever, well, it's not the worst day ever, it's just a really bad day, but you emphasize that by using hyperbole. You deliberately overstate your case. And some people have thought that maybe Jesus is using hyperbole in his description of the Great Tribulation of Judea. I don't want to rule out that possibility. Hyperbole is certainly real. I think Jesus does use hyperbole at various points in his teachings. However, from all that I know about the Great Jewish Revolt, as described by Josephus, from all I know about it, and specifically the Second Roman Siege of Jerusalem, I am convinced that no greater or no more unique suffering has ever occurred than what has happened in Jerusalem at that time. So in the nearly 2,000 years since that time, I don't think anything like that has ever happened in the whole history of the world so far. Jerusalem and the suffering of that time, that was unique, that was incredibly great. So I do not think hyperbole needs to be invoked to explain Matthew 24, verse 21. And yes, I do want to say on the record here that I am including the Holocaust in those considerations. And I just want to make that very clear. I'm not trying to speak lightly of the Holocaust. I'm trying to speak in the greatest possible way about the Great Jewish Revolt. But yes, the Holocaust. I mean, some people might consider the Holocaust to be the greatest of all tribulations, suffering like no other in the history of the world. I think most of our minds probably go there first when we think about this kind of thing. Between 1939 and 1945, Nazi Germany murdered about 12 million people, 6 million of which were Jews. That is an astonishingly high body count in a very deliberate way. They did all that as well. Those numbers are staggering, but I still think that the Great Jewish Revolt still seems to be a more dehumanizing tribulation than the Holocaust. When you really get into the details, and we're going to, I think it's worse than the Holocaust, than anything that happened in the Holocaust. So yes, I think the Holocaust should be taken into account here, and the Great Jewish Revolt had worse suffering than that, or certainly more unique suffering. So for the rest of the sermon, I want to survey what Josephus has recorded for us and show you how correct Jesus was, and that we are understanding him correctly when we apply verse 21 and that whole passage to the time of the Great Jewish Revolt against Rome. So in that context, I will move forward to my second heading, that the rebels in Jerusalem brutalized one another and also brutalized their own people. And emphasis on the word brutalized. It was a brutal time, and this was Jews against Jews brutalizing each other. So please imagine for a moment an alternative history, an alternative timeline in which the Holocaust began not with Nazis murdering Jews, but with Jews murdering Jews. If you can imagine that kind of thing happening, and how terrible that would be, and how just astonishing that would be to hear about, to witness that. That is the kind of thing that was happening at the very beginning of the Great Jewish Revolt, and to some degree throughout the entire revolt, or at least through most of it, from what Josephus tells us. So I want you to imagine that as we think about all this, and make that comparison to the Holocaust if you want to. Now, of course, among the Jews there were various rebel factions. They were not a united front. There were different factions of rebels. One of these rebel factions, whom I have called the original Zealots, was mostly composed of robbers who entered Jerusalem toward the beginning of the war. So remember, these are not, idealistic freedom fighters per se. These are robbers. These are the kind of people that they make their living by killing people and taking their money, or at least seriously injuring them. And then all those people started flocking into Jerusalem at the beginning of the war. And old habits die hard. Sure enough, those robbers, those zealots, spent a lot of time just robbing and torturing and murdering people. It was a very frequent problem throughout that entire time, as Josephus records things. Meanwhile, there was another faction whom I have previously named the Outsiders, led by a guy named Simon Bar Giora. I have mentioned him before. I call them the Outsiders because for a while they were outside the city before they eventually got into it and joined everything happening in there. Well, at some point, the original Zealots decided to hold Simon's wife as a captive. This was their plan to bring down Simon and his faction. They're going to capture his wife and hold her captive. And they did hold her captive. But Simon he doesn't negotiate on those kinds of circumstances. He responded to this by capturing and torturing and murdering as many Zealots as he possibly could, until the Zealots finally cried uncle and let his wife go. So there you have another kind of interfactional violence there in the factions there in Jerusalem. I will also say that both of these factions, the original Zealots and the Outsiders, both of these factions at various points in the war hired foreigners from Idumea to help them in their fight against the fellow rebels. I've talked about the Idumeans before and how they intervened at the request of some of these factions. And you got to remember, these are Idumeans, these are foreigners, these are not Jews, so they don't have the restraint that would come with brotherhood and national solidarity. They're foreigners, they're coming in, they have no problem killing Jews, and so they killed Jews, and they killed them in brutal ways. So, if you think what the Zealots and the Outsiders were doing to the Jews was bad, the Idumeans were even worse in some of the stuff they were doing. And they were brought in by the invitation of Jewish factions. So it kind of comes back to the Jews anyway on that point. Also, moving along here in the severity of all this, the Zealots, the outsiders, and the Idumeans, they all had a habit of executing the city's leaders, including the priesthood, sometimes without trial, sometimes only with sham trials, simply to silence them or to take their wealth. So even the higher-ups of the city of Jerusalem were not exempt from this. I mean, very often the various people of these factions would capture those people, take their stuff, and just kill them. It was a very common thing. Furthermore, anyone who publicly mourned the death of any of these leaders was also killed. So if you show any kind of mourning over the deaths of your leaders, you too will be killed. And the death toll for this alone is pretty striking. The death toll from these murders alone reached about 12,000 people. So 12,000 people were killed just because they shed tears over the deaths of their leaders, the unjust deaths of their leaders, I might add. So that's the kind of thing you're dealing with these factions. Now I have to mention a third faction that I've not mentioned yet in this sermon. I have mentioned them before, but there was the royal zealots. This was a split from the original zealots, and I call them that because they followed their self-proclaimed king, a guy named John of Giscala, who claimed to be king of the Jews during this time. This guy, now this is bizarre, but I'm going to relate it to you just because we're talking about this kind of thing in this sermon. So John of Giscala had a band of Galileans who would run around the city and killing people, stealing stuff, assaulting women, doing all those kinds of things, while dressed up as women. And yes, you heard me correctly. They were doing all those things while in drag. They were dressed up like women, running around, killing people, stealing stuff, assaulting women, and also committing acts of sodomy, acts of homosexuality as well. So again, a very bizarre action, but that's the kind of stuff happening in the city. And this is, again, Jews against Jews at this point. So that kind of thing is also happening during the Great Jewish Revolt. Adding to that high-handed immorality, people who were trying to worship in the temple at that time were often murdered in the temple. So you go to the temple trying to maintain your duty to God during all this time, and you're not safe there. The temple is no sanctuary. You could be killed there. The Idumeans killed 8,500 people, worshippers, at one time. So 8,500 worshippers all at once. So a bunch of people were either in the temple or trying to get into the temple, and the Idumeans just laid into them and just started killing these people. They're in the temple and around the temple. Also, the two zealot factions were very often fighting over control of the temple. And so if you were a worshiper there and you were in the wrong place at the wrong time when one of these battles broke out between the zealots, you would die there. I mean, you were trying to worship God, but you'd be killed there between the two zealot factions. So all of that, Jew versus Jew. Now, the Romans finally show up eventually. And as I've mentioned before, at that time the factions did try to start working together, but that didn't really work. I mean, old habits die hard, like I said earlier. And the factions were still doing all of this stuff to each other, even as the Romans were breaking into the city. They just kept on doing this the entire time. Now, you might be wondering, with things as terrible as they were for such a long time, even before the Romans showed up, did anyone try to escape? Did anyone try to leave Jerusalem to get away from all this mess? Well, yes, many people did try to leave the city of Jerusalem. Many of them tried to surrender to the Romans when they came, finally. So they're trying to get out of there no matter what. But the rebels would always kill anyone trying to escape. Some people did get out. We'll hear more about them later. They didn't fare too well. But if the rebels actually caught anyone trying to escape from Jerusalem, they would kill them on the spot. So it was taking a real risk. You either die now or die later, basically, as you try to escape. So yeah, I mean, that's the kind of situation you have. Now, just to give you an idea of how bad things were, I just want to throw this in for flavor here. There was a group of 11 Jews who got so tired of all this stuff happening in Jerusalem that they tried to help the Romans breach the city walls. They actually thought that it would be better for the Romans to get into the city and take control than to suffer more under these kinds of situations. Those 11 people did not succeed. They were caught and they were captured, and they were killed by the Jews, of course. So again, Jews killing Jews, that's the great theme. But that gives you an idea of how bad all this was. So you see that even before the Romans came, before the Romans showed up, things were so bad in the city. I mean, there were just brutal sins being committed. Jew versus Jew there in the city among the people of Jerusalem. Now, whenever a foreign, tyrannical enemy is trying to desolate your people, that is fittingly called a tribulation. But whenever it's your own people desolating you, your own people desolating each other, that is a great tribulation. And therefore, I think the wording of Jesus is very fitting at this point when you think about all this Jew versus Jew violence that was going on. So much for the second heading. We'll now move on to the third. Now that we've seen the atrocities of the Jews against the Jews, we'll now see the atrocities of the Romans against the Jews. So during one phase of the siege, the Romans were capturing about 500 Jews per day who had left the city trying to search for food. You'll see later that there wasn't a whole lot of food in Jerusalem, and a lot of people left the city trying to find food. They were often captured, and at one point the Romans were capturing 500 of these guys every day. Now, these Jews would be ambushed, of course. They'd be captured, and as punishment and as a further warning against the other people in the city, the Romans would crucify as many of these people as they possibly could. And they would do that in full view of the city. Now, remember, there are 500 of these Jews being captured every day, and the Romans are crucifying as many of them as they possibly can. So, potentially 500 crucifixions a day? I mean, depending on how many trees they have. And when you think about it, I mean, the whole city of Jerusalem would have been ringed by a forest of crosses and men groaning and dying in agony on those crosses. And that's what you see when you go up to the walls and look out to see the situation of the day. You just see a bunch of these crosses out there and people dying on them. I mean, that's what you deal with during the siege of Jerusalem. Now again, I don't mean to speak lightly of what the Jews suffered during the Holocaust, but I will say this. The gas chambers were a relatively quick way to die during the Holocaust. I mean, you turn on the gas, in a few minutes you're dead. Crucifixion can take days. I mean, you're just dying in absolute agony. And hundreds, thousands of these Jews were killed in this fashion. So definitely a more staggering way to die. Now, having said all of that, I want to point out, in all fairness, that the Romans were still capable of some mercy toward the beginning of the siege. They didn't immediately go full brutality on the Jews. There was some capacity for Jews to leave the city if they could get past the rebels, if they could make it to the Roman camp and surrender. They might be taken in, they might be accepted toward the beginning. The problem was General Titus of the Roman army had a really hard time controlling his own soldiers. These guys were there to kill, and nothing was going to stop them, not even orders from their general was going to stop them from killing. And so a lot of these people, a lot of these Jews that escaped would die anyway, even if there was an offer of mercy for those who escaped. Josephus relates an event in which 2,000 Jewish deserters were killed by these soldiers at one time. And they were killed because the Romans found out that these Jews were swallowing gold because they wanted to smuggle their money and their gold and their treasures out of the city. So they would swallow it and have it in their stomach when they escaped. Well, the Roman soldiers found out about that, and they wanted that gold, so they'd just be cutting these Jews open to get the gold out of their stomachs. And 2,000 of them at one time were butchered that way by these Roman soldiers. I mean, it's just stuff like that is happening, even at a time when there's still technically an offer of mercy from General Titus. Now, of course, Titus orders his soldiers to stop this stuff, but there's no stopping that. I mean, it just kept going no matter what. Now, the real turning point in the attitude of General Titus himself was at the burning of the temple. Up until that time, he was willing to extend mercy if he could get his soldiers to go along with it. But after the burning of the temple, he decided the time for mercy was past. So after that, there was no restraint. There was no order to stop killing these Jews. Titus himself went all out with just killing as many of the Jews as he possibly could after the burning of the temple. There was an incident where a bunch of priests tried to surrender to Titus after the burning of the temple. He refused and had them killed. There was another group of Jews that offered to abandon the city. They were going to give up the fight. They were going to just leave as long as they could take their wives and their children with them. Titus said no. Man, woman, child, you're all going to die. And he just killed them all, just when they were asking to surrender. So there came a point when the savagery became ultimate savagery for those that were trying to surrender. Now there was another thing happening at this time. Murdering these Jews were not the only way to deal with them. The Romans also started the practice of selling Jews into slavery at this time as well. So they would they would have so many of these Jewish prisoners that they could sell them for really cheap prices. Supply and demand, right? You got this whole multitude of Jewish prisoners, and you got people willing to buy them as slaves. You're selling them for a penny each or whatever. Just really exorbitant. Now, even at that time, though, the Romans stood a chance to make some money off these people, but even then they could not stop killing them. Josephus relates an event where on one occasion 11,000 Jews were killed while the Roman soldiers were trying to sort them out, trying to figure out who do we sell as a slave, who do we just outright kill. I guess they got frustrated and just started killing them all. So that kind of thing was still happening, even when they stood a chance to make some money off of these Jewish prisoners. Now, this whole idea of selling them as slaves and taking them prisoner and all that, it brings to mind something that Jesus says in Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse. I want to read that to you now because this also came true. This is Luke 21, verse 24, where Jesus says this: "And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." So according to Jesus, the Jews would be led captive into the nations. And selling them into slavery accomplishes some of that. Another thing, though, was General Titus's victory tour. After he was done with everything at Jerusalem, he took all of his prisoners and all of his treasures and kind of went on a victory tour all the way from Jerusalem back to Rome. And all this time, he'd be showcasing these prisoners. He would also have gladiatorial games with these prisoners. And a lot of these Jewish prisoners were made to fight to the death in the gladiatorial games that Titus had. In just one of these games, to give you an idea, this was for General Titus's celebration of his brother's birthday. So remember, this is a happy birthday present to his brother. In just one of these games, 2,500 Jews were killed in the gladiatorial arena as part of these games. So even after the dust settled at Jerusalem, the killing wasn't over. A lot of these prisoners still met with unhappy ends. And that kind of thing was happening all the way back to Rome, where General Titus was granted a triumph, which is a victory parade that successful generals and emperors very often had. Titus's father was emperor by this point, so he was kind of in with the right people. So he got a triumph, and he paraded a bunch of these prisoners before the people at Rome there, and a bunch of the treasures. And to end those festivities, they actually executed Simon Bar Giora, one of the leaders of these rebel factions. They executed him before the cheering crowds at the Temple of Jupiter there in the city of Rome. So all the way to Rome, the killing was still going on, technically. So all that to say, a long trail of atrocities from Jerusalem to Rome, but especially at Jerusalem, perpetrated by the Romans against the Jews at this time. Well, so far, I have described how the Jews afflicted the Jews and how the Romans afflicted the Jews, but I have not yet described the single greatest enemy of the Jews at this time during the Great Jewish Revolt. And that great enemy was starvation. the lack of food and the hunger and the desperation there, this alone is just absolutely horrifying when you read about it in Josephus. So Josephus mentions that Jerusalem would have normally had enough food inside of it to last for years. I mean, they were stockpiling food in there, and they could have lasted a good long while. The problem was the rebel factions had a habit of destroying each other's food stores. I mean, you want to beat the enemy, right? So hit them in their stomach, basically. But they were doing that to each other well before the Romans showed up, and they were destroying all the food within the city, just trying to undermine one another. Now, again, I'm going to make a Holocaust comparison. Imagine in the Holocaust, on the rare occasion that you actually do get food. Imagine if your fellow Jews took that food from you and just destroyed it. They didn't even eat it themselves, they just destroyed it. I mean, imagine that happening, which, to my knowledge, in the Holocaust, that never happened. I mean, the Jews were all suffering together at that point. But here in the siege of Jerusalem, this happened constantly. The Jews were destroying one another's food and therefore hurting themselves by destroying all that food. Now, along with the problem of all that food being destroyed, there's another problem. General Titus, as I said in another sermon, he had the greatest timing of any general in history. He managed to trap a bunch of people in Jerusalem who had come there for the Passover. Of course, this is one of these great festivals of the Jews where all the men are supposed to come to the city of Jerusalem. Well, there was a year where a bunch of those people came to Jerusalem for the Passover, and Titus got there right after that and shut them all up inside the city, just swelling the population of the city at that time. So now you got a situation where Jerusalem has less and less food to feed more people than normal, far more people than normal. So you've got just a staggering amount of starvation going on. People began to die of starvation soon after the Roman siege. That became the great problem from then on out. Josephus describes the situation so severe that parents stole from their children, children stole from their parents, and the rebels stole from everybody. They're still going around stealing food. As much as they can find, they're trying to get it. They would break into people's houses. They would say, where's your food? And they would say, oh, we don't have any food here. And the rebels would just torture these people until they finally confessed where they had their food hidden. And then they would kill them and find their food and take it. So that kind of thing was happening. It was every man for himself in a very large degree at this point in time. But you have that many people dying of the starvation, let alone the violence. Now, so many people were dying of starvation in the city of Jerusalem that it was impossible to bury them. There wasn't enough time, there wasn't enough room to bury these people. So they would just throw them over the city walls into the valleys. There are two great valleys around the city of Jerusalem, and very often they would just chuck the bodies over the walls into the valleys rather than actually burying them. That's the result of all this starvation going on. Meanwhile, the Romans had a practice of eating their meals in full view of the city walls just to mock the Jews. So there they are, I guess, sitting underneath the crosses that they have outside where they're crucifying all these people, just eating their lunch so that the men on the walls can look down and watch them eating just to mock them. So that kind of thing was happening. Josephus also describes a group of Jewish deserters who were so swollen from famine that they died by eating too much too quickly. Once they finally did make it to the Roman camp, the Romans did give them food. This was a rare episode of mercy, but they still died because they were so swollen from the famine in the city that they ate themselves to death. So that kind of thing was happening as well at the siege of Jerusalem. Now, back inside the city, people were taking more and more desperate actions to get something, anything to eat. Josephus describes people who were eating leather, they were eating hay, just trying to get something that might be remotely edible. There was another group of people that took to rummaging around in the sewers of the city to find excrement so they could eat the excrement. And that'd be better than nothing, I suppose, by that point. So they've got that kind of thing going on. And then in just a heartrending climax, to Josephus' description of all this stuff. He describes in great detail the story of a woman who ate her own infant. She ate her child just because there was nothing else to eat. So cannibalism was also happening at this point. Now, that particular incident brings to mind a scripture that I think is fitting to read. This is from Deuteronomy 28, where Moses describes some of the curses that would befall Israel if they became so wicked that God had to punish them by bringing in an army to punish them. So Deuteronomy chapter 28, verses 52 through 53 says this: "It shall besiege you in all your towns until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout your land. And it shall besiege you in all your towns throughout your land, which the Lord your God has given you. Then you shall eat the offspring of your own body, the flesh of your sons and your daughters, whom the Lord your God has given you, during the siege and the distress by which your enemy will oppress you." Well, such was the experience of some of these people in Jerusalem during the time of the Great Jewish Revolt. So yes, that kind of thing was happening. This terrible hunger is something which never ended as long as the siege lasted. For as long as the Roman siege was happening, there were people who were just not eating. And so even as the Romans were getting inside the city and burning down buildings, the Jews themselves were also burning down buildings, but for a very different reason. They were burning stuff down, just trying to find hidden stores of food. They thought there has to be food still in here somewhere. Let's burn down all these buildings and sort through the rubble and see what we can find. So they were doing that sort of thing right up. I mean, the Romans have them. I mean, they're going to win this thing in a very short amount of time, but they're still so desperate to find food. They're burning down their own city, trying to find hidden food stores. Now, I'd like to make it clear just how long this lasted. The Roman siege of Jerusalem lasted 6 months. So for 6 months, they have not enough food, and they're killing each other trying to find food. They're desperate to find food. They're eating excrement. They're eating their own children. For 6 months, this is going on. So that gives you an idea of just how horrible this is, how long-lasting it was. So with that, we can leave aside the description of the great killer during the siege of Jerusalem, which was starvation. And we can move on to the final heading for this sermon. So I'm going to bring this whole thing to an end by describing the staggering body count that resulted from all this slaughter. And when you really start to look at the numbers, it qualifies surely as the worst slaughter ever. Just the way they got to this point is certainly very unique, but the actual numbers are impressive too. The degree of suffering is pretty impressive as well. So Josephus makes an effort to calculate the number of the dead. He actually spends a lot of time on this and gives you the detail to the point where it's clear he's not just making up numbers. I mean, he's calculating this. So Josephus figures that Jerusalem had 2.7 million people in it during the siege. So 2.7 million. 2,700,000 people in the city. Now remember, most of those are Passover pilgrims. They don't live in the city of Jerusalem. They came there as part of the Passover and they got trapped there. 2.7 million people. There are people from all over Israel in Jerusalem at that time. By the end of the siege, Josephus figures the total number of the dead at 1.1 million. So 1,100,000 people. 1.1 million. Therefore, whether by the hand of the rebels or the Romans or due to starvation, basically 4 out of every 10 people died there in Jerusalem. So 40% of the people there died. Now, to give you a point of comparison as to how staggering that is, when we dropped the atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima, we only killed 3 out of every 10 people. So 30% from a nuclear bomb. In the siege of Jerusalem, it was 40%, but a nuclear bomb is just 30%. And by the way, I mean, that was only 118,000 people that we killed at Hiroshima. So not even close in terms of the number of things, but the percentage as well. It just shows you how thick the death was there in Jerusalem. Now at this point you might be thinking about the Holocaust again, and you might be protesting that far more people died in the Holocaust. 12 million people, right? It's a lot more than 1.1 million. But consider a few more points. Think about this as a matter of rate of killing, how long it took to kill these people. The Holocaust took place over 6 years, starting with the German invasion of Poland in 1939, lasting until the Nazis were defeated in 1945. So 6 years. Therefore, we can calculate a period of 6 months during the Holocaust. We figure that an average of 1 million deaths happened, just averaging it all out. I'm pretty sure it got worse as time went on overall, but as an average, you can figure 1 million people dying every 6 months. Now the thing is, the siege of Jerusalem also lasted 6 months, but the result of that 6-month time was 1.1 million people dying. So in terms of rate of death, there were more people dying every moment at the siege of Jerusalem than there was during the Holocaust. So the rate of death is even more impressive than during the Holocaust. Now, there's one way to look at it. Excuse me. I'll also ask you to bear in mind something else about the Holocaust. The Holocaust was implemented over an entire continent by several armies and camps and had been planned. This was planned out by the Nazi Party. It was brilliantly executed, although terrifyingly executed. But it was all planned out. By contrast, the siege of Jerusalem happened, that was one place, just one city. And it wasn't really planned. The Romans didn't go there trying to kill as many Jews as they possibly could. The rebel factions were not trying to kill as many of them as they possibly could. They just did. It just happened without planning. So in that regard as well, the death at the siege of Jerusalem during the Great Jewish Revolt generally is in that way more intimidating than the deaths that were happening during the Holocaust. Even if the Holocaust had a higher death count total, the way it came about is just astonishing that it happened this way. Finally, I will say this. The Nazis at least had the sensibility and the ability to dispose of the corpses. Once they killed a bunch of Jews, they could get rid of them. They could just throw them in these furnaces they had planned out and ready, and that'd be the end of it. The scene at Jerusalem was far more nightmarish. When you think about all of those bodies that could not be properly disposed of. Even before the Romans arrived in the city, the rebels had a habit of refusing burial for anyone that they killed. This was just kind of the final indignity that they could cast on these people who would dare oppose their efforts to liberate the people of God. This was their final strike against them. They would not bury them. So really what happened was there were just piles of corpses everywhere in Jerusalem, just stacks of bodies everywhere you went, both inside the city and outside the city. I mentioned that they'd like to throw them over the city walls, but they couldn't always do that, so there were bodies piled up inside the walls as well, anywhere you went. Now, once the Romans did arrive, it became even more difficult to dispose of the bodies, even if they had wanted to. Throwing them over the city walls was probably a little more difficult at that time. So the piles of corpses just grew and grew and grew throughout the city as time was going on. Eventually to the point of 1.1 million. That many bodies there. Now, to show you just how grisly this was, at some point, the Romans begin to break through the walls. So there are now holes forming in the walls of Jerusalem, and the Jewish defenders have to fill these holes somehow. So they got to find some material to use to fill these gaps in the walls. Guess what they used to fill the gaps in the walls of Jerusalem? You guessed it. They used bodies. They just got an assembly line going, and they were passing dead bodies down the line and stacking them up in these holes in the walls, trying to fill these walls. So now using them like building blocks. And on that note, let's just talk about desensitizing people. I mean, we're afraid today that we might be desensitized to violence by playing video games or watching violent movies, but I mean, it's a whole different thing what they were doing there in Jerusalem. I mean, the Romans would find, as the Romans moved through the city, they found whole houses stacked full from floor to ceiling, wall to wall, just stacked, filled with bodies. Whole houses that were now basically mausoleums, just that all throughout the city. I mean, the dead are piled up everywhere. I mean, imagine, it's bad enough for everyone you know and love to die, which doubtless happened to people there in Jerusalem. Everyone you know and love was dead. But then you still see them every day because their bodies are stacked up at the door of your house or just across the street. I mean, there's no getting away from it. I mean, that is just horrible. I mean, the Holocaust at least had this efficient process of, kill them and get rid of the bodies, burn them up. I mean, as terrible as that was, at least there weren't dead bodies lying around everywhere. But there at Jerusalem, the dead bodies were everywhere. You couldn't go anywhere in Jerusalem without stepping over dead bodies. So that's the situation as it was in Jerusalem during the so-called Great Jewish Revolt. Well, here at the end, you can see why I called this sermon Ground Zero. I mean, this was the site of just massive destruction and death. Toward the beginning of the sermon, I raised the question of whether Christ might be using hyperbole to describe the Great Jewish Revolt. Well, if he is using hyperbole, he's not using much hyperbole. It really was awful. I mean, to a catastrophic degree. The Great Jewish Revolt is certainly a candidate for the worst humanitarian crisis ever in the history of the world. And it really is difficult to imagine anything worse happening once you've sorted through everything Josephus says. And I'm just giving you the summary points. I mean, this is just a summary. Imagine reading Josephus and reading about all this stuff in detail, much more detail. But I do hope all of that at least has one good point coming from it, and that is that you can now believe Jesus when he says what he says in verse 21, that this is a great tribulation, the likes of which had never been before, nor ever would happen again. It really is that. So let's just do a summary here real quick at the end, and we'll be done. So first, I gave the opinion of Josephus, which goes part way to justifying what Jesus says in the Olivet Discourse. Secondly, I said that the rebels in Jerusalem brutalized one another and also their own people there in the city of Jerusalem. Thirdly, the Romans themselves committed atrocities against Jerusalem when they finally arrived. Fourthly, the great killer at this time was starvation, which resulted in just massive deaths. And then finally, the body count, and especially the rate of death and the constant presence of death everywhere around. Certainly indicates the worst slaughter ever, whether in numbers or in quality. It really was all that bad. And thankfully, I now don't really have anything more particularly to say about the Great Jewish Revolt or the Great Tribulation in Judea. This sermon is the end of our discussion of that in particular. My next sermon is going to be kind of tying up loose ends, I guess you could say, all the way from verse 1 to verse 21 of Matthew chapter 24. So we're not quite ready to move on to a fresh passage yet in the Olivet Discourse. We're about to, but I have one more sermon. I want to do something that I've not been able to do for these 21 verses that we've covered so far. So that'll be the next thing I do, and that'll be the next sermon you hear from me. So with that, I'm done. If you have questions about anything I said or comments you want to share with people, I'm sure there are ways to do that. You can talk to me, email me, or whatever. So be sure to do that, but otherwise, I am done. And if you have watched this entire sermon, thank you for making the extra effort to watch this particular sermon on your own time.